In 2008, a man walked into a supermarket in Zimbabwe carrying a backpack full of cash, not metaphorically, actual cash, stacks and stacks of banknotes. By the time he reached the checkout line, the price of bread had already changed. Again, the cashier updated the numbers by hand. Customers rushed through aisles, grabbing whatever food remained before prices doubled the second time. Some people were paid in the morning and spent their salaries before lunch because by evening, the money would already be worthless. At the center of this madness was a piece of paper that would later become infamous around the world, a $100 trillion banknote. A note so absurd that today tourists collect it as a souvenir, but inside Zimbabwe, during the peak of the crisis, that same note could barely buy a few groceries. And the terrifying part? Zimbabwe was not destroyed by war. No foreign army invaded the country. No earthquake flattened its cities. No plague wiped out its population. Instead, one political decision triggered a chain reaction that collapsed an entire economy. A decision that began with land. To understand how Zimbabwe reached this point, you have to go back to a time when the country was considered one of Africa's greatest success stories. Long before the trillion-dollar notes and empty supermarket shelves, Zimbabwe was known as the breadbasket of Southern Africa. Its farms were among the most productive on the continent. The country exported huge amounts of tobacco, maize, and wheat. Its agricultural sector fed neighboring countries and generated the foreign currency that kept Zimbabwe's economy alive. Factories depended on farmers. Banks financed agricultural production. Transport companies moved crops across borders. Almost everything in the economy revolved around the land. But beneath that success was a problem that had been building for generations. Because most of the best farmland in Zimbabwe was controlled by a tiny white minority. The roots of that imbalance traced back to the colonial era, when the territory was still called Rhodesia. Under white minority rule, fertile land was reserved largely for white settlers, while millions of black Zimbabweans were pushed into overcrowded communal areas with poorer soil and fewer resources. By the late 1970s, anger over land had become one of the driving forces behind the liberation struggle. A long and bloody conflict followed. Thousands died. Eventually in 1980, Rhodesia collapsed and Zimbabwe was born. Its new leader was Robert Mugabe, a revolutionary figure celebrated by many Africans as a man who had defeated white minority rule. For millions of black Zimbabweans, independence carried a powerful promise. The land would finally be returned. At first, Mugabe approached the issue carefully. His government bought farms from willing white sellers and redistributed some of the land to black families. But progress was slow and many people believed the reforms did not go far enough. Years passed, the inequality remained visible. A smaller number of white commercial farmers still controlled massive, highly productive farms, while many black Zimbabweans remained poor. Pressure on Mugabe began to grow. War veterans demanded compensation for fighting in the liberation struggle. Support for the ruling party started weakening, and by the late 1990s, Mugabe faced the biggest political crisis of his career. That was when everything changed. In 2000, the government launched what became known as the Fast-Track Land Reform Program. Groups of war veterans and ruling party supporters began occupying white-owned farms across the country. Some invasions turned violent. Farmers were assaulted. Families fled. Workers lost their homes. In just a few years, thousands of white commercial farmers were forced off the land. To many Zimbabweans, it initially felt like justice. At last, colonial inequality was being reversed. But there was one massive problem. Modern commercial farming is not just about owning land. It depends on experience, financing, machinery, irrigation systems, export contracts, logistics, and years of technical knowledge. And when the commercial farming system collapsed, the effects spread everywhere. New landowners often lacked access to loans, equipment, or large-scale farming experience. Irrigation systems broke down. Crop yields fell sharply. Banks stopped lending because land ownership had become politically uncertain. Almost overnight, agricultural production began collapsing. Tobacco exports plummeted. Food shortages spread. Factories that depended on farm products started shutting down. Foreign investors panicked and pulled money out of the country. Zimbabwe's economy had been built around agriculture, and once that foundation cracked, the entire system started falling apart. Then came the government's next disastrous move. Instead of reducing spending or restructuring the economy, Mugabe's administration began printing enormous amounts of money. At first, inflation rose gradually. Then it exploded. Prices changed daily, then hourly. People rushed to spend salaries immediately because waiting even a few hours could wipe out their value. Pension savings disappeared. Businesses collapsed. Some supermarkets stopped stocking goods entirely because there was no point selling products for money that became worthless by the next day. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached an almost unimaginable level. Prices were doubling roughly every 24 hours. The government responded by printing larger and larger banknotes. $1 million, $1 billion, $1 trillion. Eventually, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed the now famous $100 trillion note. But adding more zeros solved nothing. The currency was dead. In 2009, Zimbabwe abandoned its own money and switched to foreign currencies like the United States dollar and South African rand, just to stabilize basic trade. But by then, the damage had already been done. The economy had collapsed. Unemployment soared. Millions of Zimbabweans left the country, searching for work in South Africa, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. Hospitals struggled, schools deteriorated. An entire generation grew up during one of the worst economic disasters in modern history. And through much of it, Mugabe blamed Western sanctions and foreign interference. Critics argued the deeper problem was the destruction of property rights and economic confidence inside Zimbabwe itself. Years later, even Mugabe's allies quietly began admitting something the government once refused to acknowledge. Zimbabwe needed commercial farming expertise again. In 2017, Mugabe was removed from power after the military intervened. His successor, Emmerson Mnangagwa, inherited a country drowning in debt and economic stagnation. Unlike Mugabe, Mnangagwa took a softer approach towards rebuilding ties with investors and the international community. And slowly, something remarkable started happening. Some white commercial farmers were quietly invited back, not necessarily as owners, but as business partners and consultants. Joint farming ventures began appearing across the country. The government also started discussing compensation for displaced farmers whose land and infrastructure had been seized decades earlier. It was an extraordinary reversal. The same state that once celebrated removing white farmers was now trying to recover the expertise and productivity it had lost. And in some areas, the strategy showed results. Tobacco production rebounded strongly. Agricultural exports improved, but the deeper issue never truly disappeared: trust. Many former farmers still refuse to return permanently because they fear the government could change the rules again at any moment. And many black Zimbabweans who benefited from land redistribution fear losing what they gained. So Zimbabwe remains trapped between two competing realities. One side sees land reform as unfinished justice against colonial inequality. The other sees the destruction of commercial farming as the moment the country broke its own economy. And perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Because Zimbabwe's story is not simply about race or famine or even inflation. It's about what happens when politics collides with economics. It's about how quickly productive systems can collapse once confidence disappears. And it's about a painful reality many governments eventually discover too late. Destroying an old system is much easier than building a new one. Today, Zimbabwe is still trying to rebuild from decisions made more than 2 decades ago. The $100 trillion note remains one of the most powerful symbols of economic collapse ever created. A reminder of how a nation rich in land, resources and potential spiraled into catastrophe, not because it lacked opportunity, but because the foundations holding the economy together were shattered faster than they could be replaced.